My story begins when I moved to a seemingly quiet neighborhood. Spacious house, mostly quiet neighbors, clean streets. Everything seemed perfect. But there was one small problem. The local HOA was an absolute nightmare. You know those people who think they can control every aspect of your life, who dictate how many inches your grass can be, who determine what color your house can be, who freak out if you leave your garbage on the curb 5 minutes early. That's right. Those were the kind of people who were in charge. What about me? I've never been one to bow my head to neighborhood authoritarians. My work as a federal prosecutor taught me a thing or two about what's legal and what's just plain overbearing. When I moved, the HOA was very quick to try to recruit me. They sent me invitations, flyers, and even came knocking on my door a few times. They wanted me to join the community, which was a nice way of saying that I should pay absurd fees and follow their crazy rules. I politely refused. I said I didn't see the need to join, since my house wasn't originally part of the HOA. It was a small but very important detail. Some houses in the neighborhood were independent and were not obliged to follow the HOA's rules. Mine was one of them, but they didn't like that at all. They started with little provocations. They sent me letters urging me to reconsider, trying to convince me that it was for the good of the community. Then they started leaving harsher notes on my door. Until one day, when I parked my car on the street, in front of the HOA headquarters, by the way, the real hell broke loose. The next morning, I went downstairs to leave for work and was greeted by a sight that seemed straight out of an action movie. My car, a spotless black sedan, was completely burnt out. The windows were blown out, the bodywork was melted, and the unbearable smell of burnt plastic permeated the air. It was obvious that it hadn't been an accident. Someone had done it on purpose, and I already knew exactly who was responsible. Did the HOA want to teach me a lesson? Did they want to show me that I couldn't disrespect the community? Well, they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. When I saw my car reduced to a twisted, soot-covered carcass, the first thing I did was laugh. Not because I found the destruction of my vehicle funny, but because I knew exactly what was about to happen. Think about it. Someone from the HOA came up with the brilliant idea of torching a federal prosecutor's car, thinking that I was just going to put my head down and go along with it. They really had no idea what a hole they had gotten themselves into. But before I tell you what I did, let me back up a bit and explain how I knew the HOA was the culprit. First, because no one else in that neighborhood had any reason to attack me. I barely knew my neighbors. I hadn't fought with anyone, nor did I have any debts or declared enemies. The only bullshit that existed on that street was between me and the damn HOA. Secondly, because they had already been threatening me in subtle ways. At first, it was just passive-aggressive notes on my door. Then there were fake notices saying that I was violating neighborhood rules that I legally didn't have to follow. And recently they started circulating flyers saying that residents who don't contribute to the community are not welcome. Oh, and there's one more wonderful detail. The day before the fire, I received one last letter from the HOA saying something that now seemed almost prophetic. It would be a shame if your stay here became untenable. Untenable, right? Well, I guess they decided to make it quite literal. Now, back to the present. I could have simply called the local police and let them do their job. But the problem was that I already knew that the police in that place were in the pocket of the HOA. It wasn't hard to figure out. The president of the HOA was a personal friend of the local police chief. I'd seen the two of them together at events, and rumor had it that the HOA made generous donations to the city's police association. In other words, if I wanted real justice, I'd have to do it my way. So instead of calling the local police department, I made a direct call to the FBI. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Why? Because arson is no joke. Because arson is no joke, especially when it involves intimidation and extortion. I explained my situation, mentioned my profession, And it was as if I had pressed a big red button. In less than 4 hours, federal agents were on my street, analyzing the wreckage of my car and asking questions. And it was at that moment that the HOA began to realize that it had fucked up. When the officers arrived, I made a point of standing in front of my house, arms folded, watching as the neighbors sneaked out to see what was going on. It was like a scene from a movie. I saw some HOA members looking at each other, pale, clearly starting to panic. But the best thing was the HOA president. She tried to hold her pose, but you could see she was sweating. It wasn't long before she came out of her house and approached us, with that forced smile that only guilty people can pull off. "Wow, that's awful," she said, feigning surprise as she looked at the burnt-out car. "Have you called the police?" I smiled, the smile of a predator who already knows that the prey has no way out. "Not the local police," I replied, slowly. "I called the FBI." She went white. For a moment, I thought she was going to faint right there, but somehow she managed to pull herself together and forced a chuckle. "The FBI? Wow. Don't you think that's a bit of an exaggeration?" "Oh, ma'am, what's over the top is setting fire to someone's car," but I just shrugged. "Well, arson is a federal crime, and as a prosecutor, I know that the FBI loves this kind of case." She swallowed. I knew that, inside, she was desperately trying to find out how much the agents already knew, and from the way the neighbors were whispering among themselves, I was sure that in less than an hour, half the neighborhood would be talking about how the HOA was being investigated for arson. And that was just the beginning. Because, my friends, the investigation was only going to get worse for them. If the HOA thought they were going to get away with this without consequences, they were about to learn an unforgettable lesson. The FBI doesn't mess around when it receives a report of arson, especially when it involves intimidation and possible local corruption. The next day, agents were already knocking on doors, asking questions, collecting security camera footage, and analyzing any possible clue. The neighborhood, which had previously lived under the shadow of the HOA, suddenly became vocal. And that's when it really started to get good. Because when people realize that the empire is crumbling, they make a point of picking up a sledgehammer and helping to destroy it. First, an elderly neighbor, who never liked the HOA but always kept quiet to avoid trouble, started talking. He told the agents that the HOA had threatened other residents before, sending intimidating letters and imposing abusive fines on those who refused to follow the rules. Then a woman who had lived there for years revealed that the HOA president was embezzling money from association fees. Yes, embezzlement. She explained that residents paid absurd fees, supposedly to maintain the common areas, but no one ever saw any real improvements. The money simply disappeared, and anyone who questioned it was silenced with threats of fines or lawsuits. And then came the final blow. A couple who lived right opposite where my car was set on fire handed over security camera footage. And guess what? The footage clearly showed 2 HOA members hanging around my car the night before the fire. They weren't dumb enough to be filmed setting it on fire, but it was more than enough to raise very serious suspicions. The FBI agents, of course, were excited by the amount of dirt they were finding. The fire was already reason enough for a criminal investigation, but now they had evidence of financial fraud and intimidation of residents. By the end of that week, the HOA members were desperate. I received a flurry of nervous looks in the neighborhood. The president, who used to parade around like she was the queen of the neighborhood, now barely left her house. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for. A black FBI car pulled up in front of the HOA president's house. 2 agents got out, went to the door, and handed over a subpoena. Yes, she was officially under investigation. And the best part? She knew I was watching everything from my balcony, with my coffee in hand and a satisfied smile on my face. She tried to stand her ground, tried to pretend that nothing was happening. But I knew that inside she was terrified, and the worst was yet to come. Because as the investigation progressed, they discovered something even more rotten. The feeling of seeing those bastards finally getting what they deserved was undoubtedly one of the best of my life. After weeks of investigation, the FBI finally managed to gather all the evidence they needed to start taking down the HOA brick by brick. But the best was yet to come. At first, the whole neighborhood was in shock when the news began to spread. The HOA, which for years had terrorized residents with its absurd rules and abusive fees, was now being investigated for fraud, corruption, and even arson. I could see the neighbors' expressions changing. At first, there was still a certain fear of speaking out openly against the association. But as the days went by and more rot came to light, tongues began to wag. People who had never had the courage to question the HOA's decisions were now knocking on FBI agents' doors, offering testimony. Each day brought a new, shocking revelation. One couple revealed that, a few years ago, they had been forced to pay a fine of thousands of dollars for a serious violation, all because they had painted their house a slightly different shade of blue than allowed. They discovered that this money was never officially recorded, meaning it went straight into the pockets of the HOA board. Another resident said he was threatened with eviction because he didn't want to change his mailbox to a model that was more in keeping with the neighborhood. Yes, you heard right. Mailboxes. That was these people's top priority. But the icing on the cake was an elderly woman who tearfully admitted that she had been tricked by the HOA into paying an extra monthly fee, supposedly for neighborhood maintenance. When the FBI investigated, they discovered that this fee didn't even exist in the HOA's official documents. With each new affidavit, the association's image plummeted. The HOA had become an extortion machine. Little by little, the agents began to connect the dots. The money from the fees, the absurd fines, the suspicious payments, it all led to the same place. And then came the day we had all been waiting for. The next morning, I was on my balcony, sipping my coffee as usual, when I saw a convoy of FBI vehicles coming down the street. This time, it wasn't just agents in well-tailored suits with clipboards in hand. This time, they brought handcuffs. They pulled right up to the HOA president's house. The man who thought he could control all of us now had to face the law head-on. I watched as he came out of the house, his face paler than a ghost, trying to hold his pose, but clearly shaking. What happened next was simply glorious. The FBI arrested him right there, in front of everyone. The whole neighborhood watched. Some neighbors even filmed it. But the best part? The president of the HOA was also arrested. Yes, the woman who tried to play supreme leader, who looked down on me, who thought she was above everyone and everything. She was handcuffed right there, her face red with anger and humiliation. As they put her in the car, I saw her look at me. I just raised my coffee cup and smiled. But it didn't end there. After the arrests began, the HOA imploded from the inside out. The scandal spread so fast that local newspapers started covering the case. The story of a corrupt HOA, involved in fraud and even arson, gained repercussions. Residents, who had previously been afraid to oppose the association, were now demanding justice. And they got it. A class action lawsuit was filed against the HOA, seeking to recover the thousands of dollars stolen from residents over the years. The association's assets were frozen, and all its activities suspended indefinitely. And then came the biggest twist of all. The HOA was officially dissolved. Yes, gone, extinct. The same group that tried to expel me, that thought it could burn my car and make me run away, now no longer existed. The neighborhood was finally free of their tyranny. And for me, that was the greatest revenge of all. Now people live without fear of ridiculous fines. Neighbors who used to avoid each other now barbecue together, chatting without fear that someone will report them for breaking neighborhood rules. And what about me? Well, I received generous compensation for my burned-out car, and I made sure to spend some of the money buying an even more expensive car. The day the new car arrived, I parked it in exactly the same spot as the old one. I stood there, admiring the view, while remembering the whole story. The HOA thought they could force me out, but in the end, they were the ones who disappeared. If that's not a perfect ending, I don't know what is. And don't forget to leave a comment and a like to support the channel.